There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not stand at podiums. It does not raise its voice at the correct moments or lower it at the dramatic ones. It does not wear its danger on the outside where frightened men can see it and calibrate their fear accordingly. It sits at dinner tables and spills its wine. The knowledge of what Stalin actually was, not the poster, not the title, not the public architecture of terror that everyone inside the Soviet Union understood at a biological level. But what he was, in the specific and private sense, in the sense of what he could do, and how far ahead he was already doing it, that knowledge was held by almost no one. Among those who held fragments of it were his personal bodyguards. Not the ceremonial ones, not the men who stood at the public gates of the Kremlin with their chests out and their boots polished to a mirror finish. The inner ones, the MGB detail, the men who stood in corridors outside closed doors and heard the silences between conversations and learned, over years of this work, to file those silences away under a category they did not have a name for. Even they did not know the full extent. Two of them, Garin and Lev, would come to understand this during 4 days in November of 1952, not because anyone told them, because they were standing in the right corridor at the right moment, and a very old man said something to the middle distance that rearranged everything they thought they had been doing with their lives. So how did they react? That is the question. That is the only question. And the answer takes some time to arrive at because the story does not begin on the night of the dinner. It begins much earlier than that. It begins with a notebook. Garin had kept the logbook for 11 years. It was not an official document. Nothing about it had been authorized or even disclosed to his superiors, which was itself a remarkable act of quiet recklessness for a man working inside the MGB's inner security apparatus in 1952. A year when the climate inside the Kremlin had contracted to the point where the wrong adjective in a private letter could end a career, a freedom, a life. But Garin kept the notebook because Garin believed in systems. He was 43 years old. He had come up through the security apparatus the way most men of his generation had through the war, through the particular education that surviving the war provides, through the gradual narrowing of options that eventually deposits a careful, observant man into a corridor outside a powerful man's door with nothing to do but watch and remember. He had a face that people forgot while they were still looking at it. This was, professionally speaking, his greatest asset. The notebook contained times, schedules, patterns. What time the old man woke, what time he ate, how long the dinners ran when they were political versus personal, and whether that distinction held across seasons or shifted with mood. Which generals' visits made the corridor feel different afterward. Something Garin had never been able to articulate but had been tracking for 6 years under the column heading atmospheric shift, which he understood was not a rigorous scientific metric, but which had proven over time to be accurate enough to matter. He believed, with the particular faith of a man who has survived by being right, that if you watched something long enough and recorded it carefully enough, you would eventually understand it. Lev thought the notebook was insane. He was 29. He had come from the military, infantry, Eastern Front, 2 years of the kind of experience that does not produce reflective men, but does produce very effective ones. He had been selected for the inner detail 18 months ago, largely because he was enormous in a way that was useful in corridors, and because he had demonstrated, during his interview process, a near-total inability to be rattled. He was not stupid. He had understood within his first month on the detail that the old man they were guarding was not simply a political administrator. The weight of the silences outside the door told you that. The way visitors' faces rearranged themselves between entering and leaving told you that. The way even senior generals, men who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sent them into things, straightened their backs differently inside this building than they did anywhere else. He understood all of this. He simply did not write it down. "What are you going to do with it?" he had asked Garin once, gesturing at the notebook. "When you filled the whole thing, what does it tell you?" Garin had considered this seriously. "When I know the pattern well enough," he said, "I'll know when it's been broken." Lev had looked at him for a moment. And then what? Garin hadn't had an answer for that. General Volkov arrived in Moscow in late September. He was 61 years old and looked less than it, which was the particular kind of deceptive vitality that extended military careers produce in men who have the constitution for them. He had commanded the 2nd Shock Army. He had a chest full of decorations that had been earned rather than granted, which in the Soviet system of 1952 made him both powerful and faintly suspicious. Men whose loyalty had been demonstrated through genuine courage were harder to manage than men whose position depended entirely on the generosity of those above them. He had been a war hero. He was now something more complicated. Garin noted his arrival in the logbook. Volkov 3rd visit this quarter, previous June-August, duration trending longer, corridor temperature high. By corridor temperature, he meant the quality of the silence outside the door afterward. He had 5 categories. High meant something had been said inside that room that had not fully resolved by the time the door opened again. High was not common. He noted that Volkov's aide, a young colonel named Stepan who had the nervous energy of a man solving a problem in his head at all times, had been in the building 3 times in 2 weeks without Volkov. Separate visits, different floors. Garin noted that too. Under a column he had started 6 months ago that he'd labeled, with the understatement of a careful man, adjacencies. He did not know what it meant yet. He kept writing. Lev noticed Volkov the way he noticed all of them, as a physical presence, a variable in the space he was responsible for. Big man. Moved like someone who had once been told he moved well and had never forgotten it. The kind of man who occupied rooms slightly in excess of his actual space requirements. He mentioned this to Garin. Garin wrote it down. The weeks between Volkov's September visit and the November dinner were, on the surface, ordinary. The old man's schedule held its patterns. Early mornings, late nights. He had never kept normal hours and by 1952 had stopped pretending to. Dinners that ran long. Garin's logbook grew thicker. He cross-referenced Volkov's aides building visits against a separate column tracking which senior MGB officers had requested and received private audiences in the same period. He was building something. He did not yet know its shape. What he did not know, what neither of them knew, was that 4 floors below the corridor where they stood their watches, in a basement office that did not appear on any building schematic, men were being quietly interviewed. Not interrogated, interviewed. The distinction mattered and Stalin had been precise about it. Interrogation produces what the subject believes the interrogator wants. Interview, conducted correctly by the right people, with the right pressure applied in the right sequence, produces what actually happened. He had known about Volkov since July. Not suspected. No. The informant network inside the general's loyalty circle had been producing for months specific names, specific meeting locations, the specific date that had been selected, the specific reasoning that Volkov had used to convince 9 other men that the window was open and the moment was correct. The general's plan was not unsophisticated. He had been careful about the loyalty of the men he had recruited. He had avoided the obvious candidates, the ones already under surveillance, and had gone deeper into the second tier of his own network, men whose connection to him was professional rather than personal and therefore harder to map. He had selected a date during a period of known schedule compression, when the inner security detail would be rotated, and 2 of the more experienced officers would be briefly off assignment. He had, in short, done his homework. The homework was 4 months out of date. Stalin had read every report. He had made one change to his own schedule, a single dinner invitation, extended to Volkov personally, warmly, in a handwritten note that the general had interpreted as confirmation that he remained trusted. The date of the dinner was 2 weeks before the date Volkov had selected for the removal. The dinner was not a countermove. It was a curtain call. Garin and Lev were posted in the corridor, outside the small dining room at 7 in the evening on the 14th of November. They had been briefed on the guest list. Volkov, 2 aides. Intimate. The old man occasionally held these smaller dinners when he wanted the atmosphere of something personal rather than political, though in Garin's logbook the distinction between those two categories had been collapsing for years into a single entry that he no longer knew what to call. Through the door, not sound exactly, but presence. The movement of the dinner, the clatter of service, the old man's voice, which at this distance was texture rather than words, warm and unhurried, the voice of a grandfather asking about your journey. Lev stood. Garin stood. 2 large men in a corridor, doing the thing they were there to do, which was to be large and present and ready, in the specific way that you are ready when you have been doing something for long enough that readiness becomes indistinguishable from waiting. At 8:14, Garin noted in his logbook that the service had paused. At 8:17, the door opened. Not all the way, just enough for the old man to step through it into the corridor, pulling it almost closed behind him. He was in his dinner clothes, the simple dark jacket he preferred for these smaller evenings, the kind of clothing that on anyone else would have signaled informality, and on him signaled nothing at all, because he had long since evacuated his appearance of any reliable meaning. He did not look at them. This was not unusual. He rarely looked at them in corridors. They were furniture of a specific functional type, and he related to them accordingly. But he stood for a moment in the corridor in a way that was different from the way he moved through corridors, not passing through it, but occupying it, the way a man occupies a room when he has something to say and has not yet decided to say it. Then he said it. Quietly, to the middle of the corridor, not to Garin, not to Lev, to the air between them, as though the information was being filed somewhere they happened to be standing near. The general's driver, he said, has been replaced. The 2 aides inside, a small movement of his head toward the door, will be taken downstairs when the dinner concludes. Volkov will want to use the telephone before he leaves. He should be permitted to try. A pause, the kind of pause that in another man would have been for effect. He will confess before morning. He went back inside. The door clicked shut. Garin and Lev stood in the corridor. The sounds of the dinner resumed. The old man's voice, warm and unhurried, asking about something. Volkov's response, which had the careful steadiness of a man who believed he was successfully performing normalcy. The clink of a glass. Laughter, the old man's, genuine sounding, the laugh of a grandfather who has just heard something that delighted him. Lev looked at the door. Garin looked at the door. Neither of them looked at each other for a long time. The dinner concluded at 10:40. Volkov emerged in good spirits, or what read as good spirits, the particular warmth of a man who had just spent 3 hours with someone he was planning to destroy, and had found the experience of pretending otherwise to be, against all expectations, almost pleasant. He was that kind of man, the kind who could inhabit a performance completely enough to be temporarily sustained by it. His aides followed him out. In the corridor, they were met by 2 men from the floor below who were not part of the dining detail, and whose presence Volkov registered a half-second too late for it to be useful information. The aides were walked to the stairwell with the brisk administrative efficiency that the building's basement floors had been producing for decades. Volkov stood in the corridor. He looked at Garin, then at Lev, then at the door he had just come through, which had closed behind him. He asked to use the telephone. He was shown to the telephone. Garin noted the time in his logbook, 22:47. Then he stopped writing because his hand had done something it had not done in 11 years of keeping this record. which was to stop mid-entry and hover above the page without completing the sentence. He looked at what he had written. He looked at the 11 years of entries stacked behind it in the logbook's filled pages. All the times, all the patterns, all the atmospheric shifts logged under their careful headings. He thought about the word predictability. He thought about what he had believed it meant. That if you tracked a thing carefully enough, you understood it. That routine was a map, and if you held the map correctly, you knew where you were. He thought about the old man, standing in the corridor saying he will confess before morning in the same voice. He used to ask about grandchildren. He closed the logbook. The next 4 hours produced the shape of the thing, though neither Garin nor Lev was positioned to see all of it. What they knew, they assembled from the movements of the building around them, the specific traffic of a place reorganizing itself around a new fact. Senior MGB officers arriving after 11, the basement floors active in a way that produced a particular quality of silence on the floors above them, the silence of a building holding its breath, a sealed document, hand-carried, that passed through the corridor at 1 in the morning in the hands of a man Garin, had logged 11 times in the adjacencies column, without understanding what he was adjacent to. Volkov had not gone home that night. Garin noted this without writing it down. What they understood by morning, assembled from the fragments, from the administrative aftermath, from the precise and terrible efficiency of the building settling back into its routines, was this. The coup had been 4 months in preparation. 9 men, carefully selected, meeting locations chosen specifically for their distance from known surveillance positions. A date, a method, a sequence of events that would have required a window of less than 40 minutes to execute. The window had been granted. The window had been monitored. Every meeting, attended by men who reported upward before they reported to Volkov. Every reassignment, quietly countered with a corresponding move that left the board looking exactly as Volkov's people needed it to look, which is to say, exactly as it had looked before. The aides he had placed had been replaced with men who were, in the operational sense, identical, same rank, same access, same positions in the building's geography, but whose other loyalties ran in a different direction. The dinner had not been called to spring the trap. The trap had been sprung in July, when the informant's first report landed on the right desk. Everything since then had been the performance of a trap not yet sprung, maintained for 4 months with the patience of a man who understood that the most complete form of control is not the prevention of a thing, but the perfect management of it. Right up until the moment the other person realizes the management was never theirs. Volkov had spent 4 months believing he was moving pieces. He had spent 4 months being moved. The dinner, the wine spilled, the warm voice, the questions about grandchildren, the laugh of a delighted grandfather. That was not the conclusion of an operation. That was a man sitting across a table from someone who believed they were about to destroy him, looking at that belief, and finding it privately, genuinely amusing. Garin sat with this for a long time. He thought about his logbook, the patterns, the predictability of the schedule, the specific times, the specific durations, which dinners ran long for political reasons versus personal ones. He thought about how much of that predictability had been real, and how much of it had been a thing offered to watchers, maintained at the level of detail that careful watchers needed to see in order to believe they were seeing the full picture. He thought about the fact that the most significant event in the building's recent history, 4 months of a counter-operation running simultaneously inside the infrastructure he was paid to observe, had produced not a single entry in his atmospheric shift column. Not one. He had been watching. He had been recording. He had been building his system of understanding with the faith of a man who believed that careful observation was the same thing as knowledge. He had been completely and comprehensively wrong. The thing he had been watching and the thing that had been happening were not the same country. They had never been the same country, and the border between them had not been hidden, it had been managed. There was a difference. Hidden meant it was somewhere you could look and find it if you looked correctly. Managed meant someone was deciding in real time exactly what your looking would encounter. He closed the logbook. He did not open it again. The reassignment order came the next morning. Administrative post, Novosibirsk, effective in 72 hours. No explanation. Explanations were not a feature of this system, and Garin had always understood this, had filed it under things that are true about this work in the same way you file away other basic physical laws, without resentment, because resentment of gravity is a waste of energy. He took the logbook with him. He would spend the next several years in Novosibirsk with time to do something he had never had enough of during the active years, which was to read. To go back through the entries, to look for the seam, the specific entry, the specific date, the specific logged pattern where what he had been observing had stopped being the real thing and had become the offered thing, the managed thing, the thing that was true at the level of surface and not at any level below. He never found it, because there was no seam. The performance had not started at a specific date. It was not a switch that had been flipped between two states, authentic behavior and managed behavior. The thing he had been logging for 11 years had always been both things simultaneously. The schedule was real and it was offered. The patterns were genuine and they were curated. The warm dinners were actually warm and they were precisely what someone needed them to be. This, eventually, was the thing that Garin could not make peace with. He had spent 11 years developing a system for understanding a man. The system was accurate. The observations were genuine. The patterns were real. And they had told him, across 11 years of careful documentation, almost nothing about what was actually happening. He took the logbook apart eventually, not destroyed, because Garin was constitutionally incapable of destroying a record, but disassembled, page by page, and refiled by a different organizing principle that he spent months arriving at and that he never shared with anyone. Whether the new system told him anything more useful, he never said. Lev stayed. Same corridor, same door, same posting outside the small dining room when the intimate dinners happened, which they continued to do with the same warm informality, the same unhurried voice, the same spilled wine that the old man had been spilling at dinner tables for years, and that the staff had long since stopped treating as an event. The work was identical. Lev was different in it. Not visibly. He was still large and present and ready in the specific way the work required. Still the man you posted in a corridor when you needed a corridor to feel contained. He did not discuss what had happened in the November corridor with the other men on the detail, because he was not a man who discussed things, and because there was nothing in what had happened that could be discussed in a way that would land correctly in someone else's understanding. What he knew now was this: being seen is not a passive thing. It is not something that happens to you when someone looks in your direction. It is something granted, a specific and curated version of yourself, offered to the watcher, maintained at exactly the level of detail that makes the watcher feel they are seeing completely, which is the level of detail that makes the watching feel like enough. He had been in that corridor for 18 months before November. He had been alert. He had been competent. He had been watching with the full attention of a man trained specifically for this work, carrying everything the war and the system had built in him toward the job of understanding what was in front of him. He had been shown exactly what he was meant to see. The old man shuffled. He spilled his wine. He asked about grandchildren in a voice like warm bread. He moved through his building with the careful steps of someone who had earned his age and carried it honestly. None of this was untrue. None of it was the full picture. And the full picture was not hidden. It was not buried. It was sitting in a corridor at 8:17 on a November evening, in a man who was standing at a door and saying something quietly to the middle of the air about a general who would confess before morning, not dramatically, not with the weight of revelation, but in the same tone you'd use to mention the weather had changed, and then going back inside to finish his wine. The performance was not the mask, and the corridor was not the face underneath. Both were real. Both were simultaneous. And knowing this, having stood in the corridor and received the information, did not mean Lev now saw the real thing. It meant he understood that what he was seeing at any given moment was what he had been allowed to see, and that the gap between that and what was actually happening was not a thing you could close by watching more carefully. You could not close it. It was the point. There is a particular kind of protection that does not look like power. It looks like an old man finishing his wine. It looks like a warm voice asking about the journey. It looks like the kind of ordinary human frailty, the shuffling step, the spilled glass, the grandfather's laugh, that the human eye moves toward because the human eye is trained, across all its years of experience, to find threat in strength and safety in weakness. The eye is wrong. The eye is always available to be wrong. The eye is, in fact, counting on itself to be wrong in ways that can be managed by anyone who understands that what is seen and what is real are two different things, and that the distance between them is not a failure of observation. It is the only territory that actually matters. Volkov had spent 4 months moving across that territory, certain he was alone in it. He was the last person in the room to understand that he had not been alone in it since July. Lev stood in his corridor. He watched the door. He watched the old man move through his building with his careful steps and his warm voice and his dinner table frailty, and he understood that this was real, and he understood that it was also not the full picture, and he understood that the full picture was not something he was going to be given. He had been in the corridor when it was briefly, partially offered. That was all he was going to get. He did not write it down. He did not need to write it down. You do not need to write down the things that have rearranged the architecture of what you thought you understood. They are not the kind of thing you need a system to remember. They are the system.